Welcome back to the Brothers Mahoney. This is Michael.
And I am James.
And today we're discussing quite a well-known Big Finish release, being the Holy Terror, which was the 14th release in the Big Finish monthly range, being released back in November 2000. It's 2 hours and 16 minutes, and written by Robert Shearman, who on a side note is the guy who wrote Dialogue, which was an episode of the first series of the revival, and quite a well-respected episode at that.
I mean, perhaps one of the best.
Yeah, it's arguably one of the better episodes of the first series. I'd probably say the two-part finale is, on the whole, more solid, but still a pretty solid episode. And the Holy Terror features the Sixth Doctor and somewhat more interesting companion in Frobisher. And Frobisher was a companion who first appeared in the comics that we'll talk a little bit about later. But did you want to go into the plot of this one, James?
I shall indeed. And this is straight from the Big Finish website. The TARDIS lands in the Forbidden Castle in a time of religious upheaval. The old guard has been overthrown and all heretics are to be slaughtered. Obviously, it isn't the sort of thing which would happen there every day, just every few years or so. And when the Doctor and Frobisher are hailed as messengers from heaven, they quickly become vital to opposing factions in their struggle for power. But will they be merely the acolytes of the new order, or will they be made gods themselves? An evil destructive force is growing deep within the crypt, and the pair soon find out that they will be lucky to escape their new immortality with their lives. And perhaps you can tell from the plot that this story is going for a more comedic style. I'm not going to say it's a out-and-out black comedy, but even from the very first scene, it's a lot more comedy than certainly anything else we've listened to thus far in the Big Finish releases.
Yeah, it has a very different tone than most of what we've listened to. I think everything we've listened to from Big Finish thus far has been played straight, pretty much. I'm not saying there's not a few more interesting elements thrown into some of them, but for the most part, it seems like it's played like a normal Doctor Who story would be had it been made for like TV, aside from, I guess, Whispers of Terror, which they could never really make into a televised story, but it's neither here nor there. My main point being that this tone is noticeably different than what we've listened to before. It feels arguably a lot more lively, and James mentioned while you were listening to it that it has an almost Monty Python-esque sense of humor to it, and that does seem to be very much the case.
Yeah, it has a lot of moments that seem rather farcical and absurdist, and they just continue on and on throughout the story. Where it's not like the story is awful and out comedy, but there's so many multiple moments where something's happening that's so absurd, but it's being played so straight by the people who live inside this, as the plot mentioned, this foreboding castle.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that, at least on my end, I don't think I'm going to be able to adequately describe or convey exactly the stylings of this one. It's something that you really have to listen to for yourself to get the feel for. All I can say is that it's very different than all the other Big Finish that we've listened to thus far. And certainly you can hope that more Big Finish stories in the future might be able to emulate some of this. But this so far really stands alone, and I think that the response to it, which has been highly positive, sort of shows that.
Yeah, it's certainly out of the 14 ones we've listened to the most experimental, and that's even ignoring something we'll get into later.
But I guess before we jump into the plot of this one, we can briefly discuss the characters. Of course, we have Colin Baker as the Sixth Doctor. Voicing Frobisher is Robert Jezek, who has actually appeared a handful of times before in Doctor Who. He actually played a character in Battlefield, which was a Sylvester McCoy story, in I believe the last season of the original series. And he also voiced a character in Rod Down. And Frobisher is a character, like I said, who first popped up in the comic strips, but I'll let James touch on him a little bit later. We also have a handful of other characters who are very much worth mentioning. There's a Eugene Tacitus, voiced by Sam Carley, a Papin the Seventh, voiced by Stephen Atkinson. There's a Childeric, who's sort of the stereotypical evil half-brother of the newly crowned king, who's also a god, but we'll touch on that soon too. And he's voiced by Peter Guinness, who apparently also voiced someone in Dreamland, which I think is one of those animated things I can't remember what Doctor it would have been, to be honest. I know I recognize it, though.
Yeah, it's a David Tennant animation. I believe during the year of the Spassos is when this one came out. Either that or during Series 4. And for the record, neither my brother or I have actually seen Dreamland. I have at one point watched The Infinite Quest, which was another animated 10th Doctor story, that one with Martha as a companion. But it has only been that once, and it was, I think, at least 10 years ago at this point.
Now, did Dreamland come out before or after Infinite Quest, just to put this in my own mind?
Dreamland came out in 2009, so yeah, that sounds like it was the year of the Spassos. Infinite Quest came out in 2007, and they used, for the record, a completely different animation style.
Yeah, so this Peter Guinness, who voiced Childrick, also voiced someone in Dreamland, so that's sort of nice. We also have a Roberta Taylor voicing Berengaria, who is the, I guess, previous queen. She was the wife of the newly deceased god, Blasphemer. So she has a very, sort of pompous attitude.
That's one way you could say it.
I was going to say, that's not quite the right word, but it's the first that comes to mind. She's very regal, and she has a lot of dialogue that's quite biting. And to be fair, I think a lot of these characters do, but she comes to mind as one of the more unpleasant characters. Although speaking of unpleasant, we also have Lavelia, who is the wife of the new king, Papan VII, voiced by Helen Pant. Lastly, we have the High Priest Clovis, voiced by Peter Sauerbatz. And he doesn't have that much importance early on, but he later gets more spotlight shined on him. And I think he even has a few moments of some emotional resonance, especially in, I think, the last part. So I thought he was worth mentioning. And related, there is another cast member. We do have to mention Russell Stone, who actually composed the music for this one. And I mention him because he also did the music for a handful of ones we've listened to in the past, such as Rod Down. And a lot of the music he does, I think, stands out more so than the ones that he didn't do. Like, his music is usually something that we notice while listening to the story. And I think the case is the same here too. His music really adds additional life to what's already quite a lively story. So, thumbs up, bro.
Yeah, I didn't like his music as much here as I did in Rod Down. But that's just because I didn't like as much what they was going for, even though I completely understood what they was going for. Nevertheless, it was certainly noticeable when it popped up, and it popped up quite a lot during this story. But before we talk about these toys in more detail, a quick delve into Frobisher might be in order, because if you've just been watching the classic series and maybe the Reviver series, you might not know who Frobisher is, since they are a companion completely from another form of Doctor Who media.
And it's also worth mentioning that this is our first experience with Frobisher also. We've heard of him. I mean, he's one of those companions that you sort of hear about sometimes and you see pictures of because he's a bit distinctive, but we've not actually experienced him before. So, sort of a nice first impression.
Well, I just hope that the Carver got his look right, although doing blasphemy. But yeah, he's a penguin. That's the long and short of it. And this is the second of, I believe, 4 stories in total that is dubbed a side trips for Big Finish. Usually Big Finish in the past has mostly done things related to the classic series with companions and sets, or with original characters such as Dr. Eveline Smythe. Much like the Shadow of the Scourge, this is based on another form of media entirely. The Shadow of the Scourge, of course, being based on the Virgin New Adventure series, and that had Dr. Bernice Summerfield in it with the Doctor and Ace. When this one is based on the Doctor Who magazine comic strips. And Doctor Who magazine is a very long-running series that has had comic strips, as far as I know, in every single issue from when it first started in the 1980s. And the comic strips have been a feature to show off many different characters and companions who never showed up in the classic series, and in fact probably never caught up in the classic series due to maybe they're more alien than most of the people who could show up, or maybe the effects would have been able to handle it.
Yeah, there's a reason that Chameleon only popped up, twice in the classic series? King's Demons and Planet of Fire?
Yeah, when he first showed up and when he left.
Yeah, because the classic series is not really meant to have alien companions, despite the fact that there's literally no reason why the Doctor wouldn't have had various alien companions throughout his travels.
Yeah, at the very least, not non-humanoid alien companions. I guess technically Leela and Romano were both aliens, and he had those companions back to back. And depending on how sophisticated K9's programming and/or AI is, he might also count as an alien.
Yeah, and they used Astro Sideline to an extent during various stories too, just because of technical difficulties. So, yeah, there's a reason why the comic strips might have been able to be a bit more free with the companions that they chose.
Yeah, and the companion that they chose in this case, Frobisher, is a shapeshifter. I'm not sure what species he is. I think it comes up in this episode, but I think it's only said once. Is a shapeshifter who mostly takes the form of a talking penguin. Well, I mean, he talks in a rather New York carby American accent. Whenever he talked, it reminded me of a generic type of carby archetype, kind of loudmouth, kind of not using the most proper English. I don't know, it's certainly sorted out from the way the Doctor speaks. And Frobisher first appeared in The Shapeshifter, which was a two-part story from Doctor Who magazine, issues 88 through 89, which was first published April to May 1984. And he was a consistent companion to the Sixth Doctor until January 1988, which is, for the record, when the Seventh Doctor took over the role of the main Doctor in the Doctor Who magazine comic stories. And apparently that last story that he was in, he has made random various appearances since then, usually in cameos, maybe in just small and not quite cameo roles. But in that very last story he was in, he actually had a story adventure with the Seventh Doctor, or something to that effect. So at least he got kind of a send-off and didn't just disappear, which is not uncommon for the record, with characters who, especially in the early days, who appeared in Doctor Who magazine.
Yeah, and it's arguable that they almost had to have a humorous tone for the story because of the inclusion of Frobisher, because it's a little more of a, I'm trying to think of that, what's it, Weisenheimer, that tone that you pretty much only hear in New York and movies that take place in New York. He's a very loud-mouthed type penguin-y hombre. You don't see a lot of those, but I guess you know it when you see them, and he's on the cover too, like James mentioned, so it's also some quality stuff. But his inclusion almost made it mandatory that they would need to go with a more humorous tone, and I do think it works out pretty well. There's a lot of, like I mentioned before, snappy pieces of dialogue. Like almost every 5 minutes, there'd at least be one line that I wanted to write down to mention, because it's just so many pieces of dialogue that made us laugh out loud, which, again, I need to reiterate, was not common, and we haven't heard that type of thing in a previous Big Finish release. So it's really nice. I can't say it came as a surprise because I heard this was a more humorously tinged story, but I was sort of surprised by how well they did it.
And before we get into some of the quotes that were so good we had to write them down, I wanted to set this up a little more than the plot from Big Finish goes into detail on. Frobisher is messing with the, dimensional stability of the TARDIS? Something to that effect?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say it's messing with the TARDIS, because who can say what any of that stuff means? Even the Doctor probably doesn't know half the time.
You're not wrong about that at all. It might have been, it was something akin to that in any case. But Frobisher was literally creating fish out of nothing, or a fish out of nothing, just so he could hunt the fish. Because even though the Doctor said, well, we have tuna in the kitchen, Frobisher says, oh, it's not the same. I just want to be able to go to my primal instincts as a penguin, which is, again, more of the humor, because the Doctor points out, but you're not even a penguin in the first place. And which Frobisher replies, well, yeah, but I'm taking the shape, aren't I? Something to that effect. And because Frobisher is masked with the TARDIS in this type of way, the TARDIS, as the Doctor says, literally goes on strike and refuses to work for the Doctor. The Doctor actually has to cede control to the TARDIS, so the TARDIS will basically be able to do whatever it pleases, which, to be fair, and Frobisher points out, is kind of how it works anyway. Which, again, was hilarious. The Doctor didn't really take too kindly to that point. Because, of course, this Doctor likes to think he has perfect control of the TARDIS. But the TARDIS takes them to this ominous castle where they run into the most absurd characters that certainly we've seen on Big Finish, and perhaps the most absurd the Doctor has seen in a while. Discounting, of course, the fact that he's traveling with a talking penguin shapeshifter.
Yeah, this society is something else. Like James said, absurdist is probably a good way to describe it. So they have kings, but the kings are also gods. The story actually opens up in the dungeons because the old king/god has died, and so all the people who quote unquote worshipped the old king/god are technically heretics unless they recant, which is actually a pretty easy thing to do. It was played off like, oh, we're going to gouge your eyes out unless you recant. It's like, oh, I choose recant. It's like, oh, okay, here you are, fam. Just sign this paper, you're cool. Which is, I think, the first indication of the type of story we're getting. Because it was played off at first as a serious situation, and then it's like, oh, just sign this, we're fine. It's like, oh, it's no problem. I understand this is tradition. And that's one of the themes that as silly and what James also mentioned, irreverent as this society seems, all of it's sort of rooted in these traditions and rituals that they just keep going through. They're king gods. As theoretically, gods are not supposed to die. So the fact that they die proves that they're not gods, which means people who follow them are heretics. It's just completely ridiculous, and this type of stuff happens throughout. And we'll touch on some of it in detail, like that, like those miracles and the assassination. It's just so much stupid shit. It's just beautiful.
I mean, the worst thing is that they all just accept it too. It's just common knowledge. Oh yeah, the God King always has an evil half-brother who's deformed, who tries to take their place and usurp the throne, and always is done with the help of the high priest, who always betrays the king. But that's just accepted because they always lose anyway. But it's expected, and people accept it, and it's not even an issue. They're like, oh yeah, of course it's going to betray you. That's how it works. Because that's what always happens. That's what his father did. Because the high priest's father has always been the high priest. Of course, it's a line of kings. So I guess in that aspect, it makes sense that they've always, quote unquote, been the god kings, who then are no longer gods. So believing in them is blasphemy. And so their son is then announced a god king with a miracle to start their reign. And it just keeps going on. Tacitus, his father, has always been the scribe to write down the day-to-day life of these kings
in the most ponderous way possible. Oh, he is bathing, and there's a thoughtful look on his imperial visage today. Just second by second account of what the king gets up to, no matter how mundane. And no one reads it, too.
Yeah, no one, literally, he says to the doctor, oh, no one even reads it besides me. Which, then what's the point? But that's the thing, the entire society seems like it has no point. At least no point that people in our society would ever recognize as one. And I think the doctor even says that at what point. He heard something that just exasperated him. I forget if it was the assassination ritual, but he eventually just says, well, what's the point then? Because he was outraged as well.
Yeah, so there's a handful of things I want to mention in detail. Well, not necessarily too much detail, but this is the whole miracle. See, before the official crowning of a new king, there's always a miracle that's supposed to happen. We see a conversation between, I believe it was the high priest and Childeric, and Childeric's like, oh, what type of miracle are you going to do this time? Sawing a lady in half, which is sort of making light of the whole thing. The funny thing is, though, once we get to the actual miracle, it's like, oh, pick a card, any card.
Yeah, Cedric wasn't being facetious or hyperbolic. Literally, the miracles that this guy does, the high priest does, is just human magic tricks that are, they might be impressive if you don't know how they're done, but that's how they are. It's not even something all that impressive, but he just does a card trick with King Poppin. Poppin says, oh, that was the right card, and the crowd cheers.
And the funny thing is, it doesn't matter anyway on like 8 different levels, because one, the court scribe Tacitus just writes whatever the fuck he wants in the Bible that he's writing. I think at one point he mentioned a previous miracle was like bringing a hurricane, but it didn't happen, but he wrote it down, so it quote unquote did happen as far as history is concerned, because what's written in the Bible is true.
And of course, it has to be foretold. And again, like, we can't get into literally everything that doesn't make sense about this society or it's absurd, But he mentions that every time there's a new king, he just has to start a new Bible, because obviously since the king died, he wasn't a god. There's no point in him having a Bible, so he needs to start a Bible for the new god king.
Yeah, because the previous Bible is now just heresy. It's just a beautiful society. The funny thing is, and this is how it ties in to what Frobisher is up to. So since the TARDIS is sort of on strike and it's shut down, they sort of have to let the TARDIS choose where it's taking him or give control completely over to the TARDIS. So it brings him to this castle at the exact moment when a miracle is supposed to be performed. So this whole crowd is watching, and in the middle of the throne room, the TARDIS appears, I guess sort of solidifying the fact that Poppin the Seventh, who is this really meek and mild-mannered guy, James mentioned, and this is a good comparison that's going to mean very little to most people, but this is a 60s comedy movie called It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, which is a fantastic movie, by the way, if you're into that type of comedy. There's a character in that movie, and I can't remember the actor who played him right now, but his personality is very similar to what Poppin the Seventh's personality is. Very meek and mild, really not suited necessarily to be king, not particularly authoritative whatsoever. Like, multiple times throughout the story, he tries to get out of it because he says, "Hey, I'm not a god, guys," and he keeps trying to explain it, and people are listening because as soon as he says he's not a god, they're going to execute him, and it's just the whole thing. This society is fucked, bruh. But point being, the TARDIS pops up at the exact wrong time, and it sort of proves, not that they need any proof, because it's not like the society looks for that type of thing, but sort of proves that this guy is indeed a god king. So it's some quality stuff there too.
It ruins Childrick's planned usurpation. Childrick is going to do it right then and there because this guy, Poppin the Seventh, he's just too honest. He's literally telling them right after he was crowned, "Hey guys, I don't feel any different. I don't feel like I'm a god. So I think I'm just going to abdicate the throne because I'm not a god. I didn't really change." And so Childrick is going to right then and there take over and become the king/god. But then the TARDIS shows up, so people just believe, whether he denies it or not, that Poppin is in fact the new god. And it's just farcical absurdity after farcical absurdity. And that's even before the assassination ritual.
Yeah, and the assassination ritual is beautiful. The first episode, and this is, of course, 4 episodes total, so it's like a quote-unquote classic Who story. But the cliffhanger of the first episode has someone bursting into Poppin the Seventh's private chambers with a gun and aims a gun at Poppin the Seventh and assassinates them, or attempts to assassinate them, or so it seems. We find out at the beginning of the second episode that it's just a guy firing blanks. And I actually have this dialogue word for word because I found it just a really good example of the type of stuff we're dealing with here. We have Poppin the Seventh saying, "I still don't feel like a god. Perhaps the assassin should have used real bullets." And then we have Tacitus coming in, "Your Majesty, no one has used bullets for hundreds of years. Besides, it's unnecessary. You're a god, so they couldn't harm you. So we might just as well shoot blinks to prove you can't die." See, I can't even say it with a straight face, but I think even the Doctor was impressed with quite the syllogism they came up with.
Yeah, no, that's the point. He demanded, "Okay, we need to go see your history books because this is just stupid." And that's not quite how he phrased it, but you knew that's exactly what he was thinking.
And the Doctor was specifically pissed off, not because of the farcical nature of the ritualistic assassination attempt. I mean, it's stupid and it's curious, but I think he's more pissed off, and he's more curious because people were actually killed, like the guardsmen outside. Like, people actually died, even though this whole thing's like a fake piece of theater, pretty much. People actually died outside of the chambers for the assassin, or the fake assassin, to do it. So I think that's what really peeved the Doctor off.
Yeah, and of course they died because the gods always die and the king always lives.
So, I mean, you could theoretically argue like the gods signed up for it, though I highly doubt the gods. I mean, in this type of society, I imagine the gods didn't get much choice. And to be honest, it seems like no one gets much choice. Free will isn't really a thing here, which Frobisher later finds out.
But to be fair, it's one of those strange cases where it depends on how you want to define free will. And I promise you we're not going to get into that discussion because that could take a while. But hashtag no free will. But continuing, I'm pretty sure the gods, in one sense, maybe had free will, but I'm almost positive that Tacitus or one of them says, well, the gods have been waiting for this all their lives or something to the fact. The gods knew they were going to die here. It's not like they didn't know because the gods always die. So in the sense that they could have tried to not die, that's physically true, but because of the constraints in the way that the mind works, that this is just the ritual, this is just the formality we go through, of course we're going to die. So in that sense, whether they have free will is actually kind of irrelevant because they're trapped in such a mindset that they couldn't possibly go outside of it even if they physically could.
Yeah, and I just think that makes it indeed less outrageous to the Doctor, though.
No, I think that actually makes it worse for him.
And there's a handful of other scenes and lines that are probably worth mentioning, but there's just a couple of lines in particular that I wrote down because I thought they were funny. And like I said, we really had to pare this down because there was quite a few throughout the whole of the story, which were very much worth hearing. But this line, and I don't even remember who necessarily said it. It sounds like it could have been Tacitus, but I'm not sure. But it's a good encapsulation of what I guess the people of the society expect from their king/god. Quote, either the god kills them or they kill the god. That's what religion's all about.
That honestly might have been Jezek. It sounds like a line you might have said while he was talking to the priest. Either that or, funnily enough, that could have been the priest.
Yeah, and actually speaking of the priest, this is another great line and just another indication of how ridiculous this society is. You expect priests to believe in God? The church hasn't believed in God in decades. So even the priests know that these God kings aren't actually God kings, but they still go through the whole ritual of pretending, and it's just beautiful. I keep saying that, but it's no less true.
Yeah, and I believe they quote-unquote pretend because, the people expect it. Well, they would expect it if you didn't just keep proclaiming it and faking miracles.
And this one last piece of dialogue I just wanted to reference because it's a good encapsulation too of the type of humor here. But just to quote, the line blasphemy is telling the truth. So when you are listening to the Holy Tale, you do have a lot to look forward to.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, honestly, we mentioned there's Python-esque. It actually reminds me, and you haven't read the books, but it reminds me of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because that's also a very absurdist type of humor. And a lot of this sounds very much like something he would have done.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because I did think about that, and you're right, I've not read it, but I've read probably bits and pieces of it. I think I did start it at one point. But my main point being, this actually does sound a lot like what Douglas Adams would have done. And actually, now that I think about it, City of Death, which was written by Douglas Adams, has a similar feel to this one. And both James and I quite enjoy City of Death, so I didn't even think about that comparison before, but it fits pretty well. As humorous as the story is, though, it's not all humorous all the time. The Doctor is quite interested in discovering why the TARDIS brought them here, and he already senses something's very wrong with this world. When he goes to check out the histories, it's a funny line from Tacitus, because Tacitus notices one problem with the multiple Bibles, whereas the Doctor notices another problem. And the problem Tacitus notices is one the Doctor didn't even notice until he pointed it out, so that was amusing. There's a whole issue with the Bibles that the Doctor and Tacitus discuss, and then there's another mystery. Mystery's not even the right word, but we later find out that in fact the whole concept of outside of the castle, like to the average person, think about outside of the castle, that's not even the concept that people have. Like the whole life is quote unquote inside this castle. So there are some deeper things going on, and the Doctor's very invested in finding out exactly what's going on, and more to the point, again, why the TARDIS brought them here to begin with.
And this overarching mystery leads to something that I am going to most assuredly warn. If you have not listened to this, stop listening to us talking about it. Go pick it up. It should be less than $5. It might even be cheaper now because we bought this a couple of years back. Well, go pick it up. Go listen to it. It might even be on Spotify or whatever. I don't use Spotify. I don't know anything about it. But this might be there. It might be on SoundCloud. Might be able to find an illegal pirate that can be floating around somewhere. I don't really know. I don't really care how you listen to it, but go listen to it and leave because spoilers abound starting now. None of what we've discussed matters at all because this entire society is just basically make-believe. It doesn't exist. There's only one real person in this entire, what I'm going to call a simulation, it didn't really go into quite the specifics I would have liked about it. And that would be Eugene Tacitus. Eugene Tacitus, I don't know how long ago, but he apparently, as revealed in the very last part of this story, murdered his own son when he was just sleeping in his bed for basically, from what we could tell, no reason. He just says he was crazy or I am crazy when he was doing this little breakdown at the very end. And there were there were obviously hints of strange things happening. Again, throughout the entire story, people kept saying, oh, my role is to be deceitful. Oh, well, my role is to be the guy who dies here. Well, my role is to be the stepbrother who always betrays the king, but they always die in the rebellion. But I accept it because it's my role.
It got to the point where, and I imagine it was the same at James, where I kept trying to think of what plot twist they're going to throw at us, because I was expecting something, and I was wondering almost if it wasn't like a play that was being put on and like being broadcast to like rich alien folk or something like that. So I was trying to think of different solutions to what was going on, and I can say I didn't guess the actual solution, but I knew something was coming up like that.
Yeah, and the thing that's not clear to me, because I think there are two lines, they probably were contradictory, I just understood them in a contradictory way, but I'm not sure if Tacitus is punishing himself, if he threw himself into this simulation, or if this is a jail for our civilization he's in, and this is just the punishment that perhaps murderers get, or that he was sentenced to go through this, because this just cycles through and through and through. Tacitus is always the scribe. The story just resets itself every now and then, where Tacitus has no memory of what happened before, and he's just described to a new king, and it keeps going and going and going, and every now and then, and we didn't even get to it, but every now and then a representation of his son is born into the simulation. The son kills everybody, and then he kills his son again. In a very twisted purgatory, where his sins are just relived again. It's actually a lot like a Hellraiser movie, one of the newer ones.
That's actually a good comparison.
It's actually very similar to, for example, what's one of the better ones? The fifth one. Bloodline?
Yeah,
No.
Hellraiser Inferno.
Yes, and if you watch it, forget the fact that I said there was one of the better ones, because there are issues with that movie. But the idea of you paying for the sins you've done by just going through it over again and again and again, and I'm sorry for the spoilers because I just realized that's probably a spoiler for that movie. Nevertheless, it's very similar to this. And after he kills his son, the simulation or whatnot resets, and he goes through it all again. And it just cycles for eternity. I don't know how old the guy is, but it seems like this has been his life for who knows how long, the last 100 years, maybe even longer.
Yeah, and I think James makes a good point about the ending not being quite as clear as I wish it could be, because I have the same questions. Like, I assume all of this is some sort of self-imposed punishment, but I don't know how it could be. And I'm also not quite sure. I think James said this takes place in some type of pocket dimension. So did Tacitus just create a pocket dimension to punish himself unknowingly? Maybe he knew back then. I don't know. There's just some questions I wish we got answered that I don't think were adequately answered. And that is my one, I don't want to say problem, because overall I still very much like the story. But that's my one big issue with the finale of this one.
Yeah, I think to answer that, keep in mind something like even the TARDIS is a pocket universe. And the entire reason, in fact, that the TARDIS was drawn to this area was because it needed to stabilize its own dimensional boundaries and whatnot. So it was just attracted to something very much like it, and what it was attracted to was this type of soul that worked in the same way. There's nothing outside, quote unquote, the castle. The people don't even conceive of anything outside the castle. It's all just a simulation, and it's all just taking place in this one prisoner's soul. The best I can think of is that I suppose it must be an actual civilization who is trapping him and imprisoning him this way. Except I would think that this type of punishment is something the doctor would actually want to stop, and he just leaves.
It just came to me, but I'm sort of reminded of Haven Sant.
Yeah, it's very Haven Sant-ish, isn't it?
Yeah, just the repetition of the punishment just happening again and again. What was that thing even called? Like a time something. Yeah, I had to look it up because I forgot, but yeah, confusion dial is what the Doctor is trapped in Haven Sand. And it just has a sort of a similar vibe to this one once we find out exactly what's going on.
Yeah, the ending of the story is a very clear tonal shift because we're seeing this guy remember what his actual life is and was. Because throughout all of this, part of the thing about the simulation is he doesn't remember that he killed his son. He doesn't remember anything about that. He just assumes he has a son because he knows his son will one day be the scribe. Another thing that annoyed the Doctor. But that was one of the first times we see a little hint when the Doctor asks him about his son. He just very brusquely, and this guy usually was, oh, that brusque is more grandiose. He just said, oh, I don't want you to talk about it. Oh, he looks like me, I guess. I don't really remember. Something to that effect. And everything is literally designed around the fact that this is somebody who killed his son. We have the royal family, which I'll call it just to be simple, who are always these abusive ushers to their children. We have the mother, which is a name I'm not great at pronouncing. Berengaria, I'll leave it at that and not try to butcher it again, has some very soulful moments when she's talking to Pippin at the end, where she's basically parodying something that Tacitus is saying at the same exact time is actually cut very well, where she's saying, you know, I've never loved you as a son. I don't know what's wrong with me. I've just never cared at all, which is exactly what Tacitus is saying to the representation of his own son who he murdered, that there's something wrong with him. He just didn't care and then he killed them. And so the entire thing is kind of a psychological manifestation. Such references we're making this episode. It's also very Silent Hill-esque, if you're a fan of that video game series. But it's a psychological manifestation of the horror that this guy has committed, that he's just been forced to live through again and again and again. And the thing that starts out is this rather, perhaps dark comedy, but comedy nonetheless, very farcical, very, oh, it's amusing, ends with the death of Tacitus, who murdered his own child years ago and just was trapped in a fantasy, forgot about it, and just keeps reliving the murder of his child again and again and again. And something about that is so horrifying. I mean, you don't need me to say that to you. That just saying it, just thinking about it sounds horrifying. And I don't know, the ending is so tonally different from how it begins, but it also is almost a perfect ending. Besides, of course, again, the confusion about how this punishment is happening. And one last thing I like that ties it together, which goes back to Frobisher, is that in the very last section of this, when the Doctor and Frobisher are just talking about it, which, by the way, is something that's really been missing from the last season of Doctor Who, the Doctor and companion discussing what they've been going through. I think literally Rogue might be the only one that's actually done that. Maybe it's more with an Empire of Death.
I would like to see something like that at the end of Dad and Babel, but that would have been sort of interesting, but they sort of lost the opportunity.
Yeah, I really do understand the urge to end it the way they did. I completely get that. I would have liked maybe a reference in the very next episode. I don't know. Either way, Frobisher is just extremely depressed about what he's gone through. It's been a bit of a whiplash for him.
And there's a reason for that we'll actually touch on in a few seconds.
We might be the first people to discuss this story without using the famous line from it until this late into the video, but don't worry, we know the line you're all thinking. And Frobisher's just trying to get consolation from the Doctor, and the Doctor, he kind of goes into the background in a lot of this story. He's around and he's saying smart things, but I didn't notice him as much. Frobisher's kind of a scene stealer, and maybe that's because of just the voice acting, but either way, I didn't notice Baker as much as I usually do, but he still did have a lot of good lines. And when he's discussing this with Frobisher, he says, if it's any consolation, none of these people, none of the suffering is real in the first place. And Frobisher says, well, that doesn't change it. They thought they were real. They thought they were suffering. And the Doctor replies with very nice music in the background, just like the fish in the bathtub. It thought it was real. It had perhaps dreams. It had hopes. Even if it was never alive, it thought it was. And the pain from that is just as true as the pain from anything that was actually alive in the first place. And again, he has this nice line. I don't have it written down, but I just re-listened to it a little earlier today. about how when you're traveling in the TARDIS, perhaps one place you visit will be a group of people who are completely forgotten wherever you next visit. Once the Doctor leaves, they might as well have not existed at all. In some ways, the Doctor and whoever the companion he's traveling with are like fleeting gods, and they're the only ones who retain memories of these civilizations.
Yeah, and it's easy to feel sort of like divinity if you're traveling in the TARDIS. It's easy for that type of thing to go to your heart. And I think that Bege really brings it together at the end, talking about his own struggles with that type of thing too. It's actually, I think, a really strong sequence from Bege.
It's very touching because Frobisher says, well, that doesn't make me feel any better, is it supposed to? And the Doctor just sighs and says no. And then they just go back into the TARDIS and continue their journeys.
Yeah, it's really sort of a downer ending for such a humorously tinged story.
And speaking of one of the bits of humor, it's also doubly funny in this one because Frobisher actually gets proclaimed a god.
Yeah, we mentioned that Papin the Seventh really isn't cut out for this line of work. It's just not him. So he actually abdicates the throne successfully, and he decides instead to give godhood and kinghood over to the guy he's been talking to for the past couple of hours. None other than Frobisher. And the second episode actually culminates in this decision, which on the side note Frobisher is not warned about beforehand. Because Frobisher is just talking with Papin the Seventh about things that they could do to potentially make the society better. Papin the Seventh actually talking to Howard, but instead of trying to instigate any of this himself, he's like, hey, I'm not a true god, but I know who is. And he pretty much just gives over authority to Frobisher, which the people are completely down with. These people are
they're extremely pliable.
As long as they have a god, they're cool with it. Like, it doesn't really matter. As long as they have a god, it's fine. And they all accept Frobisher. And the cliffhanger of the second episode ends with them saying, I'll hail the big talking board.
Yeah, which is automatically always going to be a classic line. And indeed, I have not seen a single written review of this that does not have that line somewhere in the review.
Yeah, and this stood out to me. I mean, it's a completely hilarious line anyway, but it's also funny because like most cliffhangers end on something like dangerous or deadly or like, oh, how are they going to get out of this? And this one just ends on Frobisher becoming a god. And I forget what his exact reply was, like something like, oh, God, or something like that. But yeah, it was a beautiful way to end part 2.
I think his exact words were, oh my God. And then the theme starts playing.
Yeah, that was just fantastic. And I also think it added some good depth to Frobisher because he actually did try to make changes to the society. There's a whole thing about him trying to hold democratic elections. And then there's a line like, oh, the people want to know who you want them to vote for. So it's just beautiful.
Yeah, he was trying his best to change the society. He pardoned Pippin, even though Pippin is quite willing to die. He pardoned somebody who got his tattoo slightly wrong. Because if you get his tattoo wrong, it's blasphemy because you are mutilating the visage of the true God. And it's just all this stuff that he's just trying to change. None of it really works. Then everybody gets murdered anyway.
Yeah, not only does it not work, that's even, like James said earlier, that's even matter. Because these people aren't necessarily really people. Yeah, it's just all a thing. And I do think it gives some nice little character depth to Frobisher, which, like we said earlier, it's not even a character we know. This is the first time we've experienced him. But he starts out as somewhat of a loudmouth penguin type hombre. And we learn that he actually does have some, I guess, fundamental goodness in him.
Yeah, and to be fair, if he's traveling with a doctor, if anybody travels with a doctor for a long amount of time, you almost certainly have fundamental goodness in you. The doctor's probably not going to travel with somebody who he thinks is just quote-unquote broken. And the all really is tied together by a nice line from the Sixth Doctor that he says at the very beginning of the story, when, again, discussing Frobisher hunting this fish he made just to hunt it when he doesn't need to do it. As the Sixth Doctor says, it isn't to who the cruelty is directed, it's the cruelty that is wrong. And it really is the perfect way to phrase how somebody like the Doctor must think, especially one like this one, who is very bombastic, but at the end of the day, his heart is always in the right place. And he says that line, and then this whole story plays out. when none of it was quote-unquote real. But the emotions that the Sixth Doctor and Frobisher go through, those are real. What they experience was real for themselves, even if the reality itself wasn't real. I just think on the whole, the story had very strong connective tissue. And the themes that the story is going for are just consistent throughout. And it's just very impressive on the technical writing level that the story was able to maintain all the things they were juggling. You don't usually get Doctor Who stories that can talk about things like free will, morality, the essence in some ways of human nature itself.
Yeah, this one tackles some really deep topics that we actually could talk about at length for a while. Like James mentioned, free will, I would say, is arguably not even a real thing in reality. Like, I don't know if you even really have free will. I sort of doubt it if you look at it in the definitions that people usually use. But that's the whole point, that this really tackles some deep topics, and we haven't necessarily seen the same type of, I guess, approach with some of the previous stories. Certainly, you could argue that most stories try to tackle some type of deep idea. Like the Fearmonger is all about potentially the rise of fascism, but this just feels a little more, I don't know, potentially badly constructed.
Yeah, to me, it certainly feels more cohesive than something like the Fearmonger, which was good. I'm not saying it was bad in any way, but this, I think, delves into the issues around of which it's speaking in a more thoughtful manner.
Yeah, and I do have some praise I want to give this story. Before I do that, what does the placement of this story look like?
Well, as listeners know, the TARDIS Wiki has a personal timeline for each Doctor, including the extensive extended media, ranging from the comic books, comic strips, Big Finish, and BBC audio, the multiple book ranges, and everything in between. Doctor Who canon, insofar as it actually has one, is a jumbled mess and has been forever. So I just like to see where the stories we're discussing fit into the universe as a whole, as continuity in the narrative timeline has always been of interest to me. And of course, this one's interesting because it's tying Frobisher as a companion. So it's not going to fit maybe in a normal place for a Doctor Who story. On the timeline, which for the record, I've not worked on at all, but I'm happy to report what other people have worked on. And I have in fact donated to the TARDIS Wiki before, so it's an amazing source. Right before this is the BBC Past Doctor Advances novel, Mission Impractical, written by David A. McEntee, which is a BBC Past Doctor book that features the Sixth Doctor along with Frobisher as a companion, which probably does not happen very often in books. I think it's a very rare occasion when that happens. Also randomly, this book has, and this isn't a spoiler because it's right on the cover, Sabalam Glitz showing up in there as well. And so that's random and interesting. Right after this book, and for the record, this came out June 1998, so it's one of the earlier ones for the PDAs. Coming right after this one is The Last Emperor, which was a short story from the Big Finish Short Trips series, specifically Short Trips 2040, which was the 10th volume that they published from November 2004. Written by Jacqueline Reyno, The Last Emperor is one of the random, Short Trips did a lot of things when Big Finish was at the helm of them. And this one not only features the Sixth Doctor and Frobisher, but it also features the Second Doctor with Jamie and Victoria as well. So that's random and fun. It sounds like it's one of those stories.
Oh, Doctor, what's the bored beastie? I can see it already.
That's an awful loud one, Doctor.
Yeah, you can tell our Scottish is not particularly well-horned.
Yeah, it's not good, Grady. But it sounds like one of those stories that is through the point of view of a character who runs into the Doctor, which especially the Short Trips books really like to play around with. And for the record, we do not own Short Trips 2040. We own a couple of them, and I think there were 28 or 29 in total. And by God, that's going to take a while to attain. But that's neither here nor there. It is interesting that neither one of these, either before or after, is a comic strip, which of course is where Frobisher comes from in the first place. But that's the fun of the Doctor Who media. You never know exactly what you're going to get.
And that's a good description of this story as well, because it's just quite a bit more out there than you might expect from your normal Big Finish fare. Now, to be fair, we've mentioned before that we've not listened to any of the Beneath Summerfield Big Finish releases, and those were, of course, released before the Doctor Who range started. So it's possible that some of the elements here were also used in some of those, but we just wouldn't know about it. But either way, going back to the Holy Terror as a whole, all I can say is I thought it was really good. I thought it was fantastically written. Thematically, I thought it made sense when it came around back to the fish that Frobisher created. And I think there's a lot of really strong elements here. I wish the finale was cleaned up just a little bit. I do wish it had specified a bit more of the machinations behind some of this stuff. But overall, I thought it was a very well-written story. And I'm not sure if I can say it's my favorite Big Finish thing just because it's just a little out there. I do think it's a very good story. And I definitely can understand the praise that this one has gotten. And what did you say? At some point, they had like a 9.2 on timescales?
Yeah, right now on the timescales, and the timescales is a site not very well populated, honestly, because not many people seem to write reviews on it. But it is a site where you can rank various toys from various Doctor Who medias. I believe it was literally started for the Big Finish stuff and has since expanded to literally anything that's ever been released. You can find multiple comic stories that have no ratings at all. In fact, if we actually use the site, we would be the first people to rate the Disintegrator. So maybe that's where we should take our claim. But yeah, on the timescales, the Holy Terror has a 9.2 with over 300 ratings. So we are not the only people in the fandom to like it. Myself, I also quite like the story. Comedy is usually not my favorite thing on the whole, but this type of what I'll call honestly more British comedy, again, it's very Douglas Adams-esque, it's very Monty Python-esque. It works for me more than a lot of forms of American comedy. And I don't know, the story just all blended really together. I think the very beginning of the story with Frobisher and the Fist is almost kind of like a microcosm of what the entire story was in a way. And I think it's just extremely clever being able to wrap everything together in a very thematically pleasing way where the story was very dark and had very deep philosophical questions and was able to maintain such a cohesive feeling even with the comedy being there as well. I mean, again, the story ends with somebody who we find out who we've liked for most of the story. Turns out they murdered their own son and he was asleep for no reason at all. Not that there's really probably any good reason for that to be so. It's just amazing what this story was able to accomplish. And the music, again, it wasn't my favorite, but it fit perfectly with the story. I don't know, everything about this was pretty nice. I quite enjoyed this, and like I said, although you shouldn't be listening to this anymore if you listen to what we were saying earlier, but if you haven't listened to it, again, go buy it. It's a really good story. Out of certainly the ones we've listened to so far, I'm not going to say it's my favorite, but I will say it's the most thematically cohesive and most well-written of the ones we've listened to. And I don't think it's even controversial saying that.
Yeah, and that's just us, of course. We'll be curious to know what you thought about this, especially if you were one of those lucky people who picked this release up when it was put out on cassette tape, I think these were originally released in.
Yeah, I don't know when they included the ability to download them, but certainly cassette tapes of this exist. And since we mentioned, we can throw a picture up right now of one of the cassette tapes, I think. And yeah, it's just amazing to think that way back before you could just get these online easily, maybe you did pick up on cassette and listen to it on your Walkman while on the bus to work.
Yeah, so definitely be interested to hear what you thought about this one. So you could leave a comment either below here on YouTube, or you could reach out to us on X/Twitter. It was certainly a unique and fun one, and I have a hard time imagining it's going to be competed against anytime soon. But what do we have up next, James?
Up next, we are going back to the first Doctor with Doctor Who and the Horror of Coal Hill, which was a short novella that was published online in 2017 as part of the quote-unquote adventure calendar, which was a Christmas-related thingy, so it came out in December. And it's not only the first Doctor, but it's a pre-Unearthly Child first Doctor, which is a very interesting placement. And it's around 17 pages long, so it's a short novella. It's certainly longer than just a short story that you would have gotten in a random Doctor Who annual book or something of that nature. And for the record, that is a story that is written by Gavin Collison, which is not a name I am particularly familiar with, so I look forward to trying out their works.
Yep, plus we should mention, and you'll be seeing the cover right now anyway. I think the cover out looks nice. So, short story published online with the first Doctor. I'm down for it.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always liked the cover myself. I'm not as convinced with some of these online released Doctor Who stories, but I'm always willing to give any of them a shot. So it's really nice that these things just exist and are out there for people to read and whatnot. So it'll be interesting.
That it will. But as always, you have been listening to the Brothers Mahoney. This has been Michael.
And I've been James.
Thanks very much for listening. Have yourself a pleasant night. And all hail the big talking board.
All hail the big talking board.